Canadian companies facing an uncertain environment amid trade headwinds from the United States. But can stocks on the TSX continue to hold up in the face of these challenges? Joining us now to discuss, Michael O'Brien, Managing Director and Portfolio Manager at TD Asset Management. Michael, great to have you back on the program. We got lots to talk about.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so let's start with the TSX. Some of the action we've seen today, I mean, it has been choppy, a lot of uncertainty around U.S. trade policy, tariffs. How should we be reading all this?
Well, the understatement of the year, things are incredibly fluid right now. And I think we all got to acknowledge nobody's quite sure where this is going to lead us. I think there was a very large contingent of investors coming into this year post the Trump election who simply didn't believe that President Trump would follow through with tariffs of the magnitude and scope that we saw yesterday. So I think that was one of the things that jarred markets yesterday, not just the tariffs themselves and the potential negative impacts, but also the reality that a lot of investors who were convinced he wouldn't do this, he actually did. So I think that rattled a lot of people, and it's going to take a while for investors to recalibrate because we've got a number of big dates in the very near-term future, maybe this afternoon, depending on what our Bloomberg screens tell us. If not that, then the following week there's supposed to be tariffs on steel and aluminum. April 2nd is a huge day for tariffs where the whole world basically is potentially in scope. So tremendous uncertainty right now. And so, if there were one message that I would, put out there, or at least how I'm thinking about markets is, I think we have to acknowledge this is, a very fluid situation with a very wide range of outcomes. And so I don't think this is the time to be making big bets one way or the other, make big portfolio changes one way or the other for fear of being whipsawed pretty severely. So I think this is more than just about any other time you'd hear me on the show talking. This is really the time when you want to focus. What is your long-term objective? What is your long-term goal? What do you think? Where do you want to end up 5, 10, 20 years down the road? And focus on those things, because in the fog of war day to day, it's really difficult to figure out which way the ball is going to move in any given moment based on any given tweet.
Yeah, important to have that long-term perspective when everything just changes on a dime these days. We do know when we talk about tariffs, the reason why we think of it from a stock perspective is, of course, ultimately these companies operate within an economy. And if the economy is strong, then they can do well, sell their goods and services. So what are we thinking about the economic picture in Canada right now? What do you look at as part of your process to try to figure out where we might be headed? Yeah,
well, the good news in terms of the Canadian economy today is coming into this turmoil, the economy was actually doing quite well. I think it was very encouraging. Q4 GDP came in much stronger in Canada than most people had expected. Jobs numbers have been very solid, the last couple jobs reports. The things that we had hoped would revitalize the economy last year seem to be doing that. The aggressive rate cuts from the Bank of Canada seem to be filtering through. You seem to be seeing the housing market respond. So that's the good news, is coming into this situation, I think the Canadian economy was on better footing than most of us had expected. The negative is, there are very significant economic, potential impacts from scope, the scope and size of these tariffs, 25% across the board, with the exception of energy, which is still 10%. No matter how you slice it, that's going to have a negative impact on the Canadian economy and Canadian companies. One obvious example would be the Canadian banks, which have had a very nice run, or they performed very well in the back half of last year. Their fiscal Q1 numbers, which came out just in the last couple of weeks, were very strong across the board. Some issues around loan losses, but by and large, they all beat consensus expectations quite handily. That is a place where investors will have to worry about, do we see loan losses begin to rise again if these economic impacts begin to be felt by, your manufacturing company in Southern Ontario, or, pick your scenario. So it will have a real world impact.
I think of this quote being attributed to Churchill. Maybe he lifted it from someone else's idea that you never let a crisis go to waste? I mean, we've heard a lot in Canada about the fact that what can we do to strengthen ourselves internally? Are you hopeful on that front that they'll actually make some real progress on long-standing issues in this country?
Yeah, I mean, moments like this don't come along very often, and for the sake of my ulcers, I'm fortunate, I'm appreciative of that. But it is, I mean, that is such an apt quote, because there will be decades where an issue or a problem with an obvious solution just seems impossible to attain because the political alignments just don't allow it. Moments when you get this existential external force, bringing all of these different Canadian actors together, all these different points of view. But today, you're not Quebecer, you're not an Albertan, you're not an Ontarian, you're a Canadian. And some of these things that seemed unachievable just 6 months ago, all of a sudden now the ball seems to be moving, and we'll see if that momentum continues. The most obvious example is interprovincial trade barriers. That's something that we control. We as Canadians control that. We can make a positive difference. And you're starting to see premiers and both federal and provincial leaders move in the direction of, okay, we can't control necessarily what happens, with our neighbor south of the border. We can control what we do east-west. And it's encouraging to me, this is one of the potential positive outcomes, is things that we all knew we should be doing, but just didn't ever seem to be possible. Now that puck is sort of moving down the ice.
Now, of course, with the new Liberal leader coming in by the end of this week, there is a lot of expectation that there'll be a spring election, an election at some point. Yep. On the other side of that, or even during the campaign, what would you expect to hear from the political parties about, making an environment that's friendlier for business, strengthens it?
Yeah, well, I think, the simple takeaway for me as an investor is, regardless of who wins the election, I think it's very clear when you listen to, whether it's Mark Carney on the Liberal side, who seems to be the, in a commanding position to win the Liberal leadership, whether you listen to Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives, regardless who you listen to, the common denominator is they will both be much more growth-friendly, much more business-friendly, much more attuned to economic priorities than the previous government was. So I think, regardless of who wins, we're likely to see a reset in Canadian economic policy that will be positive for businesses and markets.